Aggi, I wanted to start with you. What can you tell us about this latest strike? I mean, we mentioned how close it got to where you are and in Poland, but what more are people discussing at this point in time?
Yes, Jennifer, that's really the significance of this strike, that it happened so close to Poland's border, Poland obviously being a NATO member. What is important to note here is that it was a strike on a military base, a place that would, prior to this, had been used as a training facility for people, for Ukrainian soldiers, but no NATO members were hit during the attack. Most of the fighting in Ukraine is still very much concentrated to the south and the east of the country and around Kiev, the capital. This was not something that we've seen so close to the border before, but the mayor of this region of Ukraine pointed out at the time of the strike that this was yet another reason why, in their words, NATO should be closing the sky, essentially creating a no-fly zone over Ukraine, which doesn't look like something that NATO is willing to do at this point.
Yeah, and Aggi, I mean, we mentioned at the top of the show a little bit of the humanitarian aspect of this. You are there with a lot of the people who are fleeing this conflict. What are they telling you? And are they still focused on going to Poland, or are we seeing other European countries really take in an influx of refugees?
So a lot of the refugees have come through the Polish-Ukrainian border, 1.5, 1.6 million at this point. That is the brunt of the refugees who have been crossing the border, have been coming through Poland. And lots of the refugees that I speak to here want to stay relatively close to Poland, to Ukraine, because as far as they're concerned, this is something that they hope is a temporary thing and that they would be able to return to their homes once this war is over. But saying that, now Poland is feeling the strain of a lot more people coming into their country, and while they are doing a lot to support people, there are also people who have gone further afield to Paris and Berlin and other major cities in Europe.
Yeah, and Aggi, even the UK has come up with its own scheme to support refugees, right?
Yes. So there have been a lot of discussions about the convoluted process for refugees once they're in Calais trying to get over the border to go into the UK, and it seems like the UK is making steps to make that an easier process, but it's worth remembering that this is also clearly a difference within the EU and the UK, whereas Poland, where people can travel quite easily from Poland into Germany and then further afield, it's a lot more complicated when they cross over from France into the UK.
Absolutely. Aggi, thanks so much for your reporting there. Mark, I want to bring you in because as Aggi was just pointing out, I mean, this latest strike got dangerously close to a NATO nation. We heard Biden advisor Jake Sullivan say that there would be some type of response if it were to veer into NATO territory. What would happen? I mean, how quickly could something like this actually escalate?
Well, it would depend entirely on what the Russians did. But I think there are a few things that all of this signals, both the attack and the response. The first is that this was a demonstrative attack, and you should see it in the context of the things that Putin has said, for example, about raising the nuclear alert status. And it's really a sort of warning to NATO, to the US in particular, to not go too far in their support of Ukraine. And as far as the Russians are concerned, the amount of weapons that are being poured across the border is already too far. So they were trying to send a signal. But from the American point of view, they've kept a very clear line. That the sort of red line is the frontier of NATO. And that was what the US did again, saying, warning, just saying that, if you take one step across this line, then NATO will get involved. And given the troubles that the Russian military has been having in the first few weeks of this conflict, that's something also that President Putin is unlikely to want to see.
Do you suspect, Mark, this latest strike, and especially considering what you just said, does that sort of change Jake Sullivan's messaging going into the meeting now with China? China has tried to stay pretty neutral, but as you mentioned, I mean, that can only go on for so long.
Yes, I mean, the Chinese have, in a sense, they've stayed neutral in the sense that they haven't made clear that they're going to support Russia economically, and they have denied that they have been asked to send weapons. But at the same time, they have supported the Russian narrative. They've supported the Russian claims that the U.S. is developing bioweapons and chemical weapons in Ukraine, for which there's no evidence, but the Chinese have supported them. So it's a very, very difficult position that Chinese are in now. They have a very strong partnership with the Russians. They've got a lot of geopolitical reasons to keep that partnership strong. But in its essence, the Russians have put them in a tough position now because this is not a swift, clean campaign, and they're going to ask a lot of the Chinese if they need the kind of help economically and militarily that the U.S. is suggesting.
You said they will ask for a lot, Mark?
No, it would ask. I mean, if the Russians ask for economic help to circumvent sanctions, and if they ask for military help to resupply with missiles or whatever, that will be a big step for the Chinese to take.
Yeah, and it's interesting to note there that China actually this morning was saying that was not the case, right?
Yes, they denied having even been asked for weapons.
Yeah, Mark, there seems to be a lot of conflicting reports about sort of what's happening and sort of next steps. I mean, do you anticipate we're getting any closer to a ceasefire? Russia is also at the same time speaking or trying to talk to Ukraine again about a potential ceasefire. Are we getting any closer to this?
Well, I think the pressure on both sides to get a ceasefire is rising. The real difficulty is that if you were to just announce a ceasefire right now, it would might last an hour or two. The two sides are so wound up around places like Mariupol that you really need to separate them, and for that you really need some sort of wider political agreement, and they're still very far apart on that. So it's going to be tough.
What would the political agreement be? Because we know Zelensky still wants to meet with Putin and believes that the two presidents should actually sit down and talk. What could that agreement potentially be, Mark?
Well, we only know what the two sides have said publicly. I mean, the Russians say that what they need is the demilitarization of Ukraine. So that is a negotiable term. It doesn't have a sort of scientific, definition. So, there's probably a way to negotiate that. Neutrality, the same. And then you get to the tougher stuff like recognition of Crimea as Russian territory or recognition of the Donbas territories as independent. That initially was just laid out there as an ultimatum by the Russians, and the Ukrainians made it very clear they weren't going to do that. But they did say that, there's status is negotiable. So if you move away from recognition, of annexation or of independence, where Ukraine simply loses the territory, and you start talking about status, you can talk about different kinds of autonomy, and then it becomes, possible to engage.
Do you potentially see, Mark, any of the sanctions piling up this week to continue to work towards some of these resolutions that you just outlined right there?
Well, it does put the Russians under pressure. The sanctions that have been imposed are much faster and stronger than anybody, including the Russians, would have expected. And it is taking a toll on the Russian economy. It will take a toll on the Russian economy. It doesn't mean that the Russians are going to stop. And we don't know just how willing President Putin would be to leave Ukraine without being able to really claim victory on some of his demands. And he's going to have to be able to claim something. And exactly what that something is, we can't be sure. But the sanctions will be one element that puts pressure on him. The Ukrainian resistance is another. So it's really a very murky, for even for people involved to know exactly what the end game's going to be is very difficult.